Okay, good afternoon YouTube. It is Sunday the 8th of June, right about 12:30 in the afternoon, and this is not the video I was expecting to be shooting today. Some of you will have watched my previous video, which I was talking about the Japanese origami washi paper that I used to cover the inserts for my Midori Traveller's Notebook. And originally the plan was to allow you to vote for which paper you wanted me to use for my next insert. Well, I've been travelling for the last week in Europe for work. I got back very late Saturday morning, and I've only just starting to sleep off the trip. So I wasn't really going to trust myself with permanent glue and paper on something as valuable as my washi paper. So instead I decided to do another video. The video today, let me just get these, is going to be about these. Some of you will have seen a link that was spread around on Facebook's the Fountain Pen Network and also on the Midori Traveller's Network for a company called the BanditApple company. Now these are a series of notebooks and stationery items produced by BanditApple, who are based in South Korea, and these are handmade notebooks, handmade, hand-stitched notebooks. Now, the link that was sent around, and I'll put a link in the description at the bottom of this video, but the link was the opportunity to request a free sample. And the only thing they wanted to charge you for was just the delivery or postage costs. So I signed up for this, always interested in giving some new paper a try. So I thought I'd give these guys a go, and they were asking about $3 per notebook just to cover the shipping charges. Payments made by PayPal, and they usually say your notebooks are with you within 2 to 3 weeks. These were in my hand in about 4 days, and that is an incredible level of service from that company. So international shipping from South Korea to the UK in under 4 days, and I was amazed. Now, these have been sitting here for around about a week or two now. I haven't had the opportunity to even open them up. So what I'm going to share with you today is kind of an unboxing video. What we're going to do is we're actually going to pull one of these apart. Well, I'm going to open it up first of all, take it out the plastic, give you a quick walkthrough as to the quality of the paper and the overall feel, the finish of the notebook. And then what I want to do is extract a few pages from one of the notebooks, and we're going to do some ink tests. Now, I've done a couple of ink tests in the past, but not really in this forum, and certainly never for any use outside my own. But this is the kind of process that I want to take you through. Whenever I buy a new piece of paper, I'm always going to test it out on a variety of inks, just so I know what I can safely use on that paper. And that's really for my own benefit. This time, I'm going to film it. And I'm going to use a couple of different pens in this test. Majority of these are going to be fountain pens, a couple of different nibs, a couple of different types of ink, just so you can see how that paper performs. The first pen I'm going to be using is my Pilot Vanishing Point. This is a very fine nib. This is a Japanese fine, so really I would say this is a Western extra fine. And this is loaded with Pelican Intense Black. So nice black ink, very little shading at all. The other pen I'm going to use is going to be my Pilot Vacuumatic. Now, I purchased this from eBay from a very well-known pen restorer, and this was fully restored. This is originally a circa 1945 Vacuumatic with a fine, I would say a fine stroke medium nib, but it's quite a hard nib. There's no vintage flex in this. But this pen is loaded with Diamine salamander, and purely because of the colour of the pen. This is an absolutely gorgeous pen. So, Steph, thank you very much. I absolutely love this. I'm going to do a writing sample with my TWSBI VAC 700. This is a TWSBI medium, so I would say this is probably more like a fine stroke medium, but it's a very wet nib. And I'm going to be using this with a rather wet ink as well. I've loaded this with Private Reserve Ebony Brown. Now, this is my preferred pen of choice when I'm travelling for a couple of reasons. First of all, huge ink capacity. This pen is not going to run out of ink in a hurry. And when I'm away with work for 3 or 4 days, I want to carry something with as large an ink capacity as possible. The second feature that makes me carry this when I'm abroad, especially when flying, is the fact that by tightening the bottom of the plunger knob, you're actually sealing the main ink chamber away from the feed. So that is supposed to help prevent burping and leaking during travel. Now, Brian Goulet from the Goulet Pens recently did a video where he talked about flying with fountain pens. And to be honest, I've flown this week with my Parker Vacuumatic and I had no problems at all with this. A couple of spots of ink on the nib when we'd finished, but that was about it. So unless you're going to be flying with your pens vertically in your pocket, you shouldn't really be having a problem. As long as your pens are kept upright, then there should be no issue regarding burping or leakage at all. You might see a few little drops of ink on the nib. Sometimes that could be down to condensation. Sometimes that could just be because you've closed the cap a little bit too vigorously. But we're going to use this as the medium choice. For my broad, well, I have another TWSBI. I have my Diamond 540. This is the Amber edition, and this is with a TWSBI broad. And this is loaded with Diamine Ancient Copper. A beautiful ink, very well shaded, and it perfectly matches the pen. This is a nice wet ink, as all Diamine inks tend to be, so again, it'll be interesting to see how the paper performs with this one. The final fountain pen I'm going to use in this test is my Sailor Prophet. Now, this is currently loaded with Pelikan Fount India, and this is a quite unique nib. I'm not going to talk about that too much. We'll cover that later when we get to the writing sample. But this is Sailor Prophet, and you'll see why I'm going to use this one. And then, because I need to make this a ultimate test of the paper, I need to see what this paper really can cope with, I'm going to use my emergency Sharpie. I am a trainer, I do travel around, I do have a lot of business meetings, and an emergency Sharpie is sometimes a bit of a lifesaver, especially when you get to client and they have no flip chart pens. And then to really push this to the absolute limit, I'm going to use a nice big fat chisel tipped marker. This is a Barrel Tough Point. This is normally what I use for writing on the outside of boxes and packages, and this is really going to be a good test of any paper. So those are the pens we're going to use in our test today. I'm going to do a couple of writing samples with each pen. We'll do a bit of loops, we'll do some shading, and we'll just see exactly what this paper can cope with. And the kind of things I'm looking for feel of the paper as you're writing, I'm looking for feathering, I'm looking for bleeding, I'm looking for drying time. So let's get to it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these notebooks. Now, you will see that these notebooks come in 3 sizes. We have the handy size, 11 centimeters by 21 centimeters, which is the exact same size as the Midori Traveler's notebooks. You can see there, length is identical and also width is identical. So this is the one that I'm ultimately going to use in my Midori notebook. But Arnie Kim at BanditApple was also very kind enough to send me 2 other notebooks. One is the Carnet edition, which I'm not entirely sure if this is Midori passport size. I don't believe it is. It looks a bit too big. It does look very similar to the Moleskine Carnet notebooks. Again, as you can see, it's still sealed. You've got the hand stitching in the background there. These are handmade in Vietnam, even though BanditApple are a Korean company. And finally, we have what they call the Pee-wee size. This is the tiny little pocket-sized edition. So again, still sealed. You can see the hand stitching there on the edge of the spine. So for our test today, I'm going to be opening up the Carnet edition. Of the 3, this is the one that I'm likely to have the least amount of need for. So we're going to put the other 2 aside and let's get this open. So let's have a quick look at the details on the front. We can see this is the paperback, so nice and flexible. This one is square ruled. 64 pages of ATGSM heritage paper printed with a veggie based ink. Paper is acid free, handmade and fair business. Handmade in Vietnam by the BanditApple company. You've got the details there, their address, and also I'll point out the website address there, banditapple.com. So if you do like these notebooks, if you like what you see in the example today, as I said, Goulet pens over in the US are now carrying these. I haven't really researched any UK distributors, but certainly if you go to the BanditApple website and you're able to speak Korean, because I couldn't find an English translation, there will be details there. But also what I'll do is I'll put a link in the description below which will take you to their sample request page. So the sample request, you type in a couple of your details, you put in your post address and postcode, choose what you want a sample of, and they'll ask you to make a very nominal PayPal payment. So I'll put the details for that up there as well. But let us get this opened. Love that sound. So the paper cover is textured. You have a craft paper finish, very thin, or I suppose thick paper or thin card. And this is textured. This is, don't know if you can hear that, but this is a slightly ribbed finish to the paper. The notebook itself, well, we can see quality is very good. Trim lines are nice and even. You can see there that the alignment for the printing is very good. Certainly the alignment horizontally across the page is very good indeed. Cuts are nice and clean. There's no rough edges here. There are no little bits of paper hanging off, and just running my finger along the edge there, and I can feel very, very little variation in the cut. So this has been produced very, very nicely. You can see there that we've got stitching on the spine, and I believe this has been hand stitched. And if I open up on the inside, again you can see the stitching there in the center. The paper quality itself, well, this is actually a bit thicker than I was expecting. So it's certainly on a par with the paper used in the Midori Traveller. It is very smooth, has a very nice feel to it as you're turning the pages. And as you can see, this is a very bright white paper, and we have some, well, quite dark ruled gridding on the page. So if you like very faint ruled, or if you like dot pads or whatever, I don't believe faint or dot is an option with these. You have plain, you have lined, and you have squared. And this is the squared one, as you can see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate out a couple of sheets of this paper. I'm going to do that off camera because unfortunately that's going to require the use of a rather sharp pointing implement. And I will be back in just a moment. Okay, as you can see here, I have separated out two sheets of the BanditApple paper. I have had to cut them out, and I've had to do them quite roughly, and I'll show you why. I was thinking that I could just pull these out and the paper would just tear nicely along the cut. But this paper is pretty strong stuff, and what actually happened was the stitching pulled away. Now, I don't know if this is a particularly badly stitched notebook. Maybe they didn't knock this off very well. These don't look like they're burned or glued in at the end. They're just hand stitched and left loose. And what was happening was that the stitching was starting to pull out, and that would have unraveled the entire notebook. So I didn't want to do that. Instead, I just got my blade and just sliced that out. Yes, I know it's not a clean cut, but it is a serrated edge. and for the purpose of what we're doing today, it doesn't look exactly pretty, but it should work nicely nonetheless. So let us start with our ink test. Okay, so I am kind of reaching around my tripod here, so if you do see the camera shaking a little, I do apologise. But this is one of the sheets of our BanditApple paper. So this is going to be our BanditApple paper test. And I'm starting with my fine point, and this is my pilot vanishing point. And this is currently using, what did I say was in here? Was it Pelican Fount India? No, this was the Waterman Intense Black. Performance so far. Well, this is very, very smooth paper. I'm not really feeling much of the grain in the paper here. The nib is gliding along quite nicely. So certainly with my fine nib, that's doing rather well. Let's move on to my fine stroke medium, my Parker Vacuumatic. So this is my Parker Vacuumatic Vintage. This is using Diamine Salamander. Again, incredibly smooth. Very, very nice to write with there. The paper, that is, as well as the pen. Moving on to the TWSBI VAC 700. And this is my medium nib, and as I said, this is quite a wet medium. And this is using Private Reserve Ebony Brown. Again, very, very smooth, and this TWSBI nib is very, very nice for exactly that reason. Okay, moving on to my TWSBI Diamond 540. This is my TWSBI Broad, so this is more like a Western fat medium. And this is Diamine Ancient Copper. Again, very, very smooth. Last fountain pen we're going to test is my Sailor Prophet. Now, I didn't really explain what this Sailor nib was all about, and that's because this is a Fude nib. So I'm just going to see if I can get that focused on the camera. For those of you that are familiar, a Fude nib is a Japanese calligraphy nib. Let's just move that somewhere over the white paper. It's a Japanese calligraphy nib that looks like it has been dropped on the floor point downwards. The nib point is angled up at 55 degrees. Now, this is used for Japanese calligraphy writing or Chinese calligraphy, and what this means is that you can do a very fine line when the pen is held vertically, but as you lean the pen down, the nib becomes flatter and flatter against the paper and gives you a broader and broader line. So I'm going to actually write with this, to begin with, inverted. And you can see that gives you a tremendously fine line. If I now write with it totally vertically, Sailor Prophet, Fude, and this is Pelican Fount India. Now, again, using the pen totally vertically will give you a nice fine line, but as I start to lean the pen back, can you see the line gets thicker and thicker until it just gets, well, somewhat obscene. So if you're after a pen with line variation and you are doing calligraphy writing, this is actually not a bad choice. The only downside to this is that you do have to change the way you write with the pen. You're going to be tilting it quite a lot. Now, for this reason, a lot of users will prefer using brush pens, because then that will vary the line width based on pressure. This will vary your line width based on the angle to the paper that you're writing at. So I'll give you a quick example here. We'll just do some very, very thin lines with the pen vertically, and I'll just start to reduce the angle against the paper, and the nib will now become flatter and flatter against the paper until it is fully in contact with the paper, and that is almost using a marker pen. Now, as you can see, that's laying down a tremendous amount of ink. It's puddling towards the end, so it'll be interesting to see how this copes with bleed through. In fact, this is not far off just swabbing ink across a piece of paper. So, wasn't too expensive. I think I paid about 15 euros for this. It was just an experiment. I've seen Fude nibs before. I didn't really have a need for one, but I just thought it'd be a bit of fun to get one. And this actually has come in quite useful. For those of you that are interested in this kind of pen, I'm actually thinking about loading this up with some of that Pelican highlighter ink, and then I can use this for highlighting, because you can highlight very fine, or you can highlight with a very fat chisel style nib, and as a highlighter I think this will be a fantastic option to carry around. So for my final test, we're going to be using my Sharpie permanent marker. This is my emergency Sharpie. So I believe, who are these made by now? I believe are they still paper made? Okay, so I'm going to call this, I don't know what to call this nib. Let's call this a fiber point FP Sharpie, and I'm pretty sure this is going to be black. So and now for the final pen in our test, a Barrel Tough Point Wedge Tip marker. I normally use this for writing on the outside of boxes and packages. So you can see this is the fattest of fat of nibs. This is probably akin to writing with a parallel. So this is going to be a chisel point. Oh, it helps if I could spell. Barrel marker black. Okay, now for the final test, we're going to use a cotton bud or a Q-tip, and all I'm simply going to do is dip this into some ink, get it nicely saturated, and then just do 3 passes along the paper. That's about the best way I can think of getting a large amount of ink down onto this paper as quickly as possible. And for this test we're going to be using my favourite ink. This is Diamine Ancient Copper, and this is actually the ink that I had loaded in the TWSBI Diamond 540. But this is a beautifully shaded ink. You may even be able to see some of the shading coming through just in the writing sample. So let us move on to the second piece of paper that I extracted, and for this we're going to do our swab test. So a little bit of ink on the Q-tip here, and we're just going to run a nice line across there. Now for drying, well, you can see that, okay, tiny little smear there, that's dry already. So the paper's certainly very absorbent, it's certainly drying nice and fast. So let us get a second pass. Still not quite dry yet. And now let us run our third and final pass. So, quite a lot of ink there. You can see that cotton mud Q-tip was very well saturated. Let's just screw that closed. Well, as you can see, the shading in the ink has come through very nicely. Light orange, or orangey brown, rust-coloured ink, shading nicely to the second pass where it's a little bit darker, and then even better in the heavy pass of ink. A fourth pass would have made this almost, well, I suppose almost burgundy red. So, just quickly label these up. This is my ink swab. It's 1 pass, 2 pass and 3 passes. Now you can probably see straight away that the fountain pen, when using this ink, goes towards the darker end. So at no point will a fountain pen give you that really nice light colour shading in the ink unless you're running a very, very fine nib. This is what I tend to see second pass from my medium nib, and third pass, well, that's what my broad nib will give me. Okay, so those are our completed ink tests. Let's have a look at the results. So, well, can we see any bleed through? Yes, and that was to be expected in the permanent marker. So the Sharpie has actually coped reasonably well. We did have there's been bleed on pretty much every stroke. You can read the writing very clearly from behind, but it's less pronounced than I would have expected it to be. And only when I start shading in with the pen do we see some real heavy bleed through. With the Beryl Tough Point, however, the big fat chisel tip marker, well, yeah, that's to be expected. Big, thick fibre tip pens, I wasn't expecting anything but that. However, looking at the rest of this, well, I can see a little bit of bleed through. Actually, that's more like show through, to be fair, here. And this was with the Pilot Vanishing point, the fine nib, where I went over that page a couple of times just doing a bit of shading. So that's actually surprised me that a fine point with a reasonably wet ink would do that. Show through again, I've got a small mark here, and that's from the Diamine 540, again where we were doing some colouring. And then just a tiny little speck. In fact, no, that's not show through at all, that's just printing from the grid. So the only show through or bleed through we have, well, to be expected in our fountain pen, our fibre point markers, and a very small amount in the fine point where I've laid down a lot of ink over the same spot a couple of times. So even with the thickest of Fude nibs and with the very broad, I suppose medium broad TWSBI Diamond 540 with a very wet ink, I think this paper has performed fantastically. So what about our triple pass? Ha, nothing. No show through, no bleed through, nothing at all. So the paper is completely contained to that ink. Now let's have a look at feathering. I've got no feathering from the swab test, but as you saw, that was a cotton bud. I am feeling some texture in the paper here where the actual fibres of the paper have raised up against the ink. Feathering in our writing sample, Well, let us have a look. No feathering on the fine. No feathering at all with the fine medium. No feathering at all with the wet medium, using the Private Reserve Ebony Brown. I can see plenty of shading with the Diamine Ancient Copper in the Broad Twisby, but again no feathering. And the test with our Fude nib, again no feathering at all. And in fact, if we look at the marker pen, even though it's a very fat, very fat line, there's no feathering or bleeding on the surface. So the paper seems to be very feather resistant. I normally find that this is the case with a very fine pulp paper, but also paper that perhaps has been hot rolled. So instead of being rolled on a cold roller, this has been rolled on a hot or a steamed roller, and that kind of gives it a very gentle sheen. All those little fibres that would be sticking up, that would catch in your nib or allow the ink to spread along the length of the fibre. Well, if you're using a very fine pulped paper, that's not going to be the case. Now, I don't know that that's definitely the case with this paper, but that's my assumption. Very fine fibre, hot rolled paper, and this is, again, a very good quality of paper. So as to the type of fibre they've used, that might be worth investigating. So this is the writing test of the BanditApple Carnet. I'm hoping you have found this useful. Do check out BanditApple. Get yourself a couple of free samples of their notebooks. I don't know how long this free sample offer is going to last, so do get in there as quick as you can. This is very good quality paper, and I'm beginning to think that the BanditApple Carnet, the full handy size, could make a very practical alternative to using my Midori Traveller. I am a bit of a purist, I know. I haven't massively customized my Midori Traveller, but I'm going to order a couple of these and just keep them handy and maybe try them out and see how they work over the next couple of months. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please do like or subscribe, and any comments you're welcome to leave in the bottom of this video. And as I said, I'm going to put links to all the items I've mentioned in the description. Okay, thank you very much.